today's episode. I am super excited. We have Jeremy Berke with us, formerly of Business Insider and now with Cultivated News. He is one of the leading journalists in the cannabis space. He has sources across Capitol Hill, across the United States. He has his finger on the pulse of our industry. We are so lucky to have Jeremy. Jeremy, welcome to the show. Let's get into it. Jeremy, let's dive right in, dude, because one of the questions I think that you've handled really well and your readers are keenly interested in is we have a president who says a lot of, let's just say, oddball things. Yet we have a situation where he has indicated to the markets, and again, in a normal environment, when a president says something, the markets react, right? And our market has a history of overreactions. Our president said he'd like to make a rescheduling decision in a few weeks. What was your take on that comment, and what has kind of been the reaction that you've heard?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me on this show, Greg. I'm really excited to be here and to jump in. Look, I want to be pretty careful with talking about what I know and what I don't know, right? I think on the first hand, what I know is that Trump was open to rescheduling, which is reclassifying cannabis from the most restrictive Schedule 1 to a much less restrictive Schedule 3 on the campaign trail. The industry certainly has been in his ear and has been in the ear of many of his allies. However, we are now 8 months into his administration where he's made really one seemingly offhand comment about it, right? He said, we'll have a decision coming. It was a very non-committal decision. And so, look, like we can read into that, what we can read into that. The market certainly like that. That comment came on August 11th. It is now September 19th that we're recording this, and nothing has really happened. And so, look, you can take the glass half full approach and say the president is very busy, as every president is, and they're working through it. They'll get to it in time. Or you can take the glass half empty approach and say, this is not a political priority. He said that on the campaign trail to score some relatively cheap political points. We are in a world where this may not happen until after the midterms or after Trump is president. If I knew the answer to that question, and I say this a lot, I'd run a hedge fund, not a media company, and I'd have made a lot of money. And so I really don't know. However, I want to also say, President Trump says a lot of things. He does a lot of things. I have my own views about his competence and leadership, but anyone who gets elected to president twice has some good political instincts, right? And rescheduling is good politics for Republicans, and it's especially good politics for MAGA Republicans who want to attract Gen Z, the youth vote, cleave off Democratic voters. And so, I think that Trump does see that. However, putting the over-under on when this will happen, I have no idea. I really don't, and I don't think anyone does.
Yeah, and I think that's a really hard takeaway for our market, right? Which is, again, in a different administration, the president says something, things tend to happen. I want to dive into something that's very interesting that you just said. It's this smart political play, right? It makes sense. You want to cleave off those young voters, get them engaged, you help them, you get them excited about cannabis, right? What has been your read on the typical congressional Republican who's out there, who's hearing these rescheduling things? I guess one question that I have is it performative when they're out there going like, this devil weed's going to ruin it? Because normally they just jump in line with Trump right there. If he says, the sky is pink, they're all like, sky's pink, we got it. So what's been your read on that?
This is a tricky issue. And I don't want to get out over my skis too much talking about the political calculus in the House, right? That's not my area of expertise, but I have a little bit of reporting knowledge on it. I think the theme in which I think about this, right? The Republicans right now are a very, very big tent. There are MAGA Republicans. There are the old sort of social conservatives, the Reaganites, that is still a very active force. There's evangelicals, right? And so Trump and JD Vance, to a lesser extent, have this job of keeping this whole tent together. And cannabis is a very, very controversial issue within that tent. I think you see, hardcore MAGA Republicans, Florida's Matt Gaetz, who's now out of office, is sort of the standard bearer of that, right? Very pro-cannabis, pro-small business, anti-drug war, right? They see it as government overreach, and it hits all these sort of quasi-libertarian tendencies that many in the MAGA movement have. Um, but look, the average sitting representative in the House and Senate in the Republican Party is around 60 years old, right? They grew up in a time where cannabis was viewed as evil. Those social stigmas die very hard. And I think, look, are they embellishing a little bit their viewpoints to score political points? Absolutely. That's part of the process of political communication. At the same time, I do really feel, in terms of my reporting, when I talk to staffers, even the members themselves, there is severe opposition to any sort of cannabis reform in the Republican Party. Severe opposition. I think, a lot of investors, particularly retail investors, either are unaware of that or they bury their heads in the sand about it because they look at Trump and say, look, this guy is pro cannabis. May or may not be true, but they don't really understand how powerful the Reaganite movement still is within the Republican Party. And I think that is a huge opposition to getting over the hump. Now, that being said, if somehow, Mike Johnson, a Southern Republican, gets on board with rescheduling, look, they may fall in line, right? That may absolutely happen, to your point. But as of right now, I see that there's a lot of opposition to cannabis legalization. And you can make all the good arguments you want to make about medical use, about reducing crime, about free markets, about job growth. Those fall on deaf ears when it comes to drug use for many Republicans.
I guess one other thing is when you talk to these staffers, every politician makes promises, right? Do you get this sense when you do this reporting? Do they even think this is going to happen? Do they really think this is going to happen?
I don't know, and I'm not trying to say that as a cop out. I think every staffer at every office believes that their priorities will happen. Right? You have to have a strong belief to get anything, passed in DC. Right? And so you have to have that conviction. At the same time, I don't invest in the space because I cover it. And I don't want to bias my reporting. My determination, if I was an investor, I would not bet on it. And that's anecdotal, right? It's anecdotal coming from my experience reporting. As a reporter, you tend to have a lot of conversations with a lot of people, and you learn how to read people pretty well. And so to answer your question, like I think there's a lot of unknowns. However, this is the Trump administration. This is 2025. He could make this all wrong tomorrow and say, "Hey, look, we're rescheduling," right? And so I want to be clear that like I really don't know. I just have my personal viewpoint on it, and I think it's going to be a long time. To really sort of underscore the question, right? I do think it's going to be after the midterms. I think there was a window in August where they might have moved on it. I think the unfortunate shooting of Charlie Kirk has really thrown their legislative agenda for a loop, and now they're focused on other things. And so I think that changes the calculus a lot.
Yeah, definitely. I have a very kind of more fun question for you. And I don't know if even these staffers would ever be that honest with you. Do you get the impression that cannabis use is actually relatively prevalent in Washington, D.C. among even Republican staffers or the Republican Party, or are they ever that forthright with you?
Um, no, I mean, I would say they're not, like, to answer the question honestly, they're not ever that forthright. At the same time, a lot of young staffers are in their 20s, right? Like they consume the product, Republican or Democrat. I think, that's pretty standard. Like you can just sort of look at the usage charts. Use is increasing among young people. Like that pattern holds, right? Whether it's in DC or in Arizona, right? So I think that's true, but I think it's the support for this issue, from what I understand, is a mile wide and an inch deep. Everyone likes it. Every, sorry, young people, all young people like it. But do they really want to move on it? Do they really want to say that this takes priority over a litany of other issues each office is handling? I don't know. I don't know how passionate many of them are. And you do need passion to get things passed. Like that's why there are activists in DC. That's why they have such a huge role on whatever side of the issue they're on in getting legislation through. I think for that to happen, the industry does need a little bit more of that, right? I think we've seen it as a bit of a settled issue in recent years, and it's not. It's absolutely not. Like this thing could go the other direction. And so I think we need that grassroots energy for sure. And political staffers, offices respond to that.
Uh, Jeremy, one key thing that's happened recently in terms of momentum, we all heard. I think it might have been leaked. Who knows by who? But that Kim Rivers not only attended a dinner with the president, but also it looks as if she's identifying lobbyists to kind of whisper into his ear. How effective do you think that's been? And do you think his recent comments were actually a result of her lobbying?
I think it's been super effective, right? I mean, it's been effective in terms of getting Trump to parrot the talking points that the industry wants, right? Whether that turns into an actual executive order or legislation, I think remains to be seen. But I will say, to Kim Rivers' credit, she has been in the room. She is spending money. That is the language that Trump speaks. And his comments on the campaign trail were very much a laundry list of what the industry wants, right? It was rescheduling. It was the Safer Banking Act, which is a piece of legislation that's never been able to be passed that would allow the cannabis industry to access the financial system, as with any other industry. And so, look, like this was an industry wish list. It was not very clearly the sort of post 2020 version of legalization that we saw in New York that talks about social justice, about racialized policing. And that is a very different view, and certainly one Trump does not share. And I think, whether or not you agree with that, to Kim Rivers' credit, she got the industry wish list in Trump's ear, and that is effective. And that for the industry is what they should be doing, right? She's doing her fiduciary responsibility, running True Leave in terms of getting legislation passed, assisting to get legislation passed that would help her company, right? And help her peer company. I don't know the inner workings about how effective the strategy will be in the long run, right? Like they certainly got that Truth Social post, but whether that turns into an executive action, I think it remains to be seen. And I don't know what more levers they have to pull. I mean, they really did get that post, they got the lip service. And so turning that lip service into action, I think, is a whole other step.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting that you kind of ballparked post midterms for anything anyway. It's an interesting insight, and I think it's politically relevant and operationally relevant for a lot of people. That look, she might be going around doing this, but the likelihood of kind of the political climate is who's going to make this hard pivot right now. It doesn't even really make sense for anyone to make this pivot into.
Right. And I think, look, like the benefits of rescheduling are very, very clear for operators, right? I think, I'm sure your viewers, listeners know this, but getting rid of the 280 tax frees up so much cash flow no matter where you are on the cannabis supply chain. It's also, I know there's some consternation among activists about what rescheduling really means, and is it, too incremental of a step, et cetera. At the same time, if Trump does push this through, this is arguably the biggest change to federal drug policy since the Nixon administration. That's a huge deal, right? And the fact that we are even talking about this, I think, look, it is not legalization. It does not go very far in terms of, cutting down arrests, et cetera, all these things that, we all in the industry care about, activists certainly care about, but it's a huge, huge signal of normalization. And America is still America, right? The rest of the world looks at how America does things, treats issues, and it follows. And so, I do believe that this is a good thing, that the industry should be aligned and push for rescheduling. I'm open to saying that. However, if it were realistic that under a Republican administration, under a Donald Trump administration, we would get full legalization, obviously that's where energy should lie. It's just absolutely not realistic at this moment.
I love that. Just absolutely not realistic. Which is the real position to take, right? Like we can all wish in one hand, but it's like, if it's look at the political reality. If you're forecasting it in the next, 6 to 12 months, you're crazy.
Right.
And speaking of crazy, this is a natural segue to my next topic, which, by the way, you don't have to share my interpretation. The DEA head that Trump picked, Terrence Cole, is one reaction. He is not someone I would say that would be friendly to any kind of rescheduling or the cannabis world at all. What was your read on Trump picking him, or what's kind of been the reaction that maybe you've heard, or your own personal take?
Look, all politics is personnel, right? Um, you can have these big ideas, but who actually executes those ideas is extremely important. Terrence Cole is not the personnel that the industry or advocates would have wanted to see at the head of the DEA. Full stop. I think, look, he's a career DEA official. He has his views on drugs, on cannabis. I don't think we're going to change his personal views. Um, so look, I think it's a negative, absolutely. The DEA has a lot of control in the rescheduling process. Ultimately, they are the arbiters of the decision. So look, it's a negative. It's not who we would want it to see. At the same time, you know, Trump does, I don't want to say rule, but he does express his power through loyalty, and that is expressed in all the federal agencies, including the DEA. So look, if Trump wants this to be done, I'm sure Cole will fall in line, but this is not something that Cole is going to do of his own volition. And his comments have been so non-committal on the issue to the point where they are negative. And so, I think that this is absolutely who we would not want it to seen in the position. And it's likely that, him and top DA officials will be roadblocks to the process. I think that's something that's absolutely true. Still my point about loyalty remains. And so, I don't know enough about the inner workings of the DA to say, here's the command structure and here's who you should reach and who you shouldn't reach. But the figurehead at the top is certainly not bullish to me, and I think anyone else.
I want to dive in from this because it's almost a natural segue in terms of how the whole administration treats cannabis, and also some of your excellent reporting. For our viewers and our listeners out there, I'm about to refer to a story that got a lot of traction that Jeremy worked on about the ICE raids over at Glass House.
Yeah.
From your reporting, did that raid feel targeted, or was it just another cog in kind of this massive, secret police, mass new kind of world that we live in?
It's a really good question, and I want to be super careful about it because it's a very hot button issue. Did it feel targeted? I think it's not an accident that they went after a cannabis facility. However, I don't believe that sending a chilling, I guess, sending a chilling effect on the cannabis industry did not seem like the intended goal. Immigration seemed like the intended goal, illegal immigration. And I think that, they're kind of in this world where like, oh yeah, and we're also sending a chilling effect to the cannabis industry. Like that's a marginal good on what we've done. That's at least my read of the situation. However, I can tell you from reported experience that it did send a chilling effect to a lot of California cannabis farms. A lot of operators, I mean, a group of them met right after the raid, which is a Zoom meeting that myself and other reporters sat on. And they said, look, like, this is what happened in the 90s, in the early 2000s under Bush as well, that they had an excuse to crack down. Like, it's immigration now. What'll it be in 10 years? So I think that's absolutely true. However, I don't want to read too much into motivations I don't know about. Right? I don't know what's going on at ICE. I don't know why they chose those two glasshouse facilities. But I do know that they were cannabis farms. There is compelling evidence that there was illegal labor on those farms, and I'm not trying to say anything about glasshouse. But it didn't seem like the amount of people violating the law they rounded up was really worth that in any stretch, right? I think. Look, they want to do symbolic things. That's what the Trump administration does, and that was a symbolic thing for many reasons, negative reasons, in my point of view. I mean, others may disagree, but look, they could hit cannabis, they could show strength on illegal immigration. All that being said, it does not bode well for how the administration wants to treat this.
Yeah, I think it was shocking to see the response given to your point, kind of the whatever they claimed that issue might have been. What if anything do you read as the kind of the longer repercussions of kind of this show of force by the Trump administration? I mean, you and I both know, good God, does California have its issues right now, whether it's taxation, whether it's black market, whether it's overregulation. When you were reporting on this issue, what were kind of some of the ramifications, but not only just for Glasshouse, but for other farmers in the space?
Look, I think one of the first things they all wanted to do, and they all can do, is just buckle down on compliance to the nth degree. And I know in California that's incredibly difficult because there's just not a lot of money to be made thanks to the regulatory environment. But doubling down on compliance, tripling down on ensuring every single worker that comes through your facility and their documentation status. Like, these are things that cannabis companies have to do, and the reason being is that they are scared of repercussions, right? You know that, like, enforcement certainly has an effect if you want laws to be followed, but this is not something that the Trump administration is hand waving away. They are trying to send fear into employers to ensure that they are following the law. And this is another way to do it, using the levers of militarized federal agencies like ICE to go in and do that is a very strong signal. And so that's what the industry is doing, and frankly should be doing right now. You need to guard against this. This is kind of scary stuff. And you don't, like, sure, you're violating federal law already being a cannabis grower. You do not want to be violating federal law under the Trump administration with immigration right now. That's a double whammy that's going to be very, very difficult to disentangle yourself from. And so I think the industry hears that, and they should.
Yeah, I 100% agree. On to move away from kind of the dire into perhaps what you and I can we'll put on our rose colored glasses for a minute. Let's say the midterms do provide a window of time where rescheduling is reconsidered. From the operators that you talk about, it's interesting. There seems to be now that it seems to be maybe a reality. There seems to be two points on the cannabis side, our side. One is, Jesus, God, hell yes, help us. And the other one is kind of like that Star Wars meme, like, it's a trap. Like, so from the operators that you talk to, what is the prevailing winds? We know about 280E. Are operators that you speak with and in your reporting, is it pretty consensus, like, we need to have this rescheduling, or is there more of a concern that there could be kind of a rug pull here?
Yeah, it absolutely depends, right? I think what we've discussed already about rescheduling certainly matters. The 280E going away, I mean, paying, as you're familiar with, upwards of 60 to 70% taxes, just thinking about the math, as wholesale prices fall, like, that's really hard to manage your margin, right? I think all operators really, really need that relief. I think number two is cost of capital coming down, right? While rescheduling may not open capital markets in a robust way, like, I'm not sure Goldman Sachs is taking US cannabis companies public on the New York Stock Exchange when that happens. Maybe, maybe not. I think they want a little more guidance. Absolutely, it would lower the cost of capital. The cost of debt would come down to more normal rates. There'd be way, way more banks willing to work with the industry, other than the smaller credit unions that most rely on right now. So all of that is an environment where businesses can actually get built, right? I think the third thing is, it just sends a signal, right? That probably this is more normal. There's less stigma. It may open more consumers to it. I don't know about that, but I'm just sort of theorizing. And it would normalize the industry in many significant ways. I think that is crucial, especially for smaller businesses, excuse me, and particularly in New York, where I am, social equity focused businesses. Like, they really do need this regulatory relief to stay alive. And for the original goals of what New York wanted to do in 2021 with its MRTA, the legalization bill, like, they need regulatory relief to achieve those goals. Absolutely. I think there is this sort of contra view that, some of the bigger MSOs, of course, they want rescheduling, they want their tax burden to come down. But at the same time, it means the barbarians may storm the gates, right? And so they want a little bit more time to plant their flags, to, build out their facilities, to capture the market. Essentially, I don't think this is a judgmental term, but to create monopolies in the states where they operate, before they can exit to whoever may exit to, or to continue operating as an independent business. So I think that is a contra view. It's a little bit conspiratorial. I think maybe some executives would admit to that. I don't think everyone would. But look, I think at the end of the day, like, rescheduling is such a good thing for so many operators in the industry. especially small businesses. I mean, they're set to benefit in a huge way. And I think again, for investors in public companies or retail investors, like just the cash flow is a without paying all that tax is a huge thing, right? That's money that can be used to expand businesses, to hire people, to get more talent in the industry. Like all that really, really, really matters for building the industry.
And I love that. I think it's dead on. I think it brings up something I was excited to discuss with you. As an operator myself, I die laughing when people, just last night, someone was like, "Oh, I'd love to get into, cannabis, marketing. It sounds so fun and creative." And I'm like, "Oh God." But so from your seat, what when and again, you interact with a lot of different reporters. You were previously at Business Insider. What do a lot of reporters get wrong consistently, or what are the things that you're like, God, if they just would take the time to get it right? Like, I'm just so curious about that world.
Yeah. Oh, I have a ton of thoughts on this. Number one, I wish a lot of reporters are very competitive. I'm not. I wish there was more reporters covering the space on a full time basis, or at least even spending half their time on the industry. Right. There are so many complexities to this beat. It is so challenging in so many ways. Not only the regulatory environment, the corporate structures, the way these businesses are forced to operate. Uh, the relative size of the industry, managing relationships just as a reporter is challenging all the time. This industry, it's particularly challenging. And then I think the other piece of that is the broader societal issues that cannabis legalization is a focal point for. The tension, between the left and the right. I think cannabis is a microcosm of all that, and you can see that in the ways that blue states legalize cannabis versus red states legalize cannabis. I mean, just look at New York and Oklahoma, for instance. Oklahoma's medical, but I think the point stands. And so I think that there's so many interesting things to pull from. Um, I will say the vast majority of reporters, especially at national publications, don't spend a lot of time thinking about it, right? They parachute in when there's an interesting story, say, the Glass House ice raids, but they get a lot wrong about the industry because they're not talking to people on the ground. They're not spending a lot of time dealing with the nuances of this. Now, there are some national reporters, New York Times, Ashley Southall does great, great work. Politico has a great cannabis team. But at the same time, I think the beat just needs more reporting. And I think, part of effective functioning markets and industries, you have media that's scrutinizing actors. That's how capitalism works. That's a fundamental belief, and that's why I do what I do. Without that, you'd have a lot of things, a lot of wrong things done. A lot of good deeds would go unreported, or a lot of sordid deeds, I should say, would go unreported, and good deeds would go unreported as well. And I think just to sort of square that answer to your specific question, yeah, it's parachute journalism in a lot of ways. And so that's part of what we try and solve at Cultivated. We want to be of the industry for the industry. That doesn't mean celebrating the industry. It means calling out people when we feel like we need to do that, but it also means celebrating wins. And so, we see that purely as a market gap, I would say.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, and again, just to reiterate for our listeners and viewers, give Jeremy a follow on Twitter. I still don't call it X. Check out Cultivated News. He's on LinkedIn as well. I want to ask you another question about kind of the role that you're playing. You are one of the rare cannabis reporters out there who's doing this full time. Because our industry is so insular, do you find it difficult to, pardon the pun, cultivate sources or find those stories, or is it the opposite? Because I can tell you also, it's a lot of like knives out in our industry as well, because it is so competitive. Like where does that kind of tension lie for you when you're pursuing stories or even getting tips about stories?
Yeah. Tread carefully, tread lightly. Look, if this was a larger industry, like let's say I was covering tech, right? And maybe, also it's a personality thing. Like every reporter, has their own way they want to write stories, who they want the subjects to be. Like I've worked with a lot of journalists who are just knives out all the time, right? And nothing gets them going more than writing a takedown. And they sort of love the fight writing the story. They love the fight once the story is published, because that's a whole other thing. You have to get out there and defend yourself a lot of the time. So look, my instinct in this industry is to tread extremely carefully. Everyone likes a negative story written about their competitor and they think journalism is great and it's fair and that's what should be done, as soon as that magnifying glass is turned onto them, my character gets assassinated, right? And so that's part of it. And I think it's also, what reporters deal with when you're covering an emerging industry. I mean, they think that media should be cheerleaders for that. And while certainly, myself, I'm a cheerleader. I consume the product. There's a lot of great people, sources who have become friends, honestly, throughout reporting on this process of legalization. That's not the media's job, right? At the end of the day, like, we are there to be skeptical, not cynical, but skeptical, and to scrutinize, to call out bad actions, to show where labor practices are failing employees, to show where testing practices are failing consumers, to show where businesses are engaging in fraudulent activity. I mean, that's the core of our job description. That's what we believe we do as a bulwark in capitalism and capital markets. And so that's going to make people upset. That's okay. Like, I can handle people being mad at me. At the same time, my lens has certainly shifted, going from Business Insider, which is a big national publication with tons of resources, and I'm protected, to actually trying to build a company within the industry itself, right? Obviously, that changes the tone of what we report on, how we report on things, how we cover things. And look, like, I do think that, for me, like, being at a big national publication, like, you're supposed to be dispassionate and unbiased. And obviously, I can go on a whole soliloquy about how that's impossible for the media in general. But with Cultivated, I'm not unbiased, right? Like, I think legalization is net good, and, like, we want to do what's in our power to ensure that cannabis reform does happen, while still being rigorous and dispassionate with who we choose to cover, how we cover it, and certainly not investing in the companies we cover or benefiting from any upside other than the media business itself. I want to make that super, super clear to the viewers.
I think I have a few more questions for you. And again, I know how busy you are, Jeremy, but one of the ones I have is, out of your reporting, let's remove kind of the regulatory aspect that you and I have covered today. What have been some of the stories that you've covered that have been concerning to you, or maybe ones, if we don't want to put it on you, where the readers have said, "Oh my God, like, this is not good for our industry"? Because I know you've done some very skeptical
Yeah.
work. Yeah, which ones really resonated?
Oh, I mean, right now, testing, the testing infrastructure, I think, has the risk of, in many states, undermining the whole project of legalization. And I don't say that lightly, right? I mean, I say that not because that's the rational view. I say that that is one of the key things that critics can really pull on, that really, really matters, right? You see that from Smarter Approaches to Marijuana, an anti-legalization nonprofit, from conservative writers, like, I don't even call him conservative anymore, but Alex Berenson, Charles Lehman at the Manhattan Institute, they rationally pull on this because one of the key promises of legalization was consumer safety, right? Like, instead of buying, a dime bag in the alleyway, I know that's such like an antiquated concept, but, like, yeah, instead of buying a dime bag in the alleyway, which could have been grown with pesticides or have heavy metals, whatever it may be, like, we have a consumer safety infrastructure that's regulated like any other product that we buy, whether it's, I don't know, salad dressing or some food product, right? We as consumers are supposed to trust that. Policymakers are supposed to trust that. Regulators are supposed to trust that. And sorely, we found that it's untrustworthy in many ways. I mean, a lot of these testing labs, I'm not going to name names, but
They can
there's so
read
much
your
reporting
article. I'll
already out there.
interject. They can read your articles if they want to know more.
Yeah, sure, right. Like, there's so many articles out there already, and they just scratch the surface of the ways they pass samples that should have failed for business reasons, the lack of regulations that states have on these testing labs. I mean, look, like, if I could wave a wand, I would say that these should be state or even federal. I mean, that's going to be a long way away, not just regulated agencies, but they should be run by the state itself, right? Because there needs to be an independent arbiter of what can pass that's not beholden to the interests of getting more clients, right? Because that's really the problem, right? Consumers want high potency, and a lot of labs are very willing to hand that out to growers and brands, in ways that hurt the consumer. And now, look, like, I'm sort of soapboxing here. Potency is one issue. Like, if you say it's, I don't know, some ridiculously high number, 35% THC, and it's actually 23, like, okay, that person is not getting hurt, but if they're combusting pesticides into their lungs and breathing that in, that's really bad. Like that's really bad, and the problems are going to compound and magnify in the future. And that's absolutely something that the Alex Berensons of the world can say, look, legalization isn't working. People are still getting sick, and lawmakers will be very tuned to that. So I think, largely the edifice of legalization of consumer safety lies in testing rigor. That's very, very important.
Yeah, agreed. Sidebar question. I have actually noticed an uptick in some of the anti-cannabis billboards out here in Arizona, for example. I can only imagine where it is everywhere. By and large, in your reporting and your sources, who has the capital and the willpower to be funding these things?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the reason I laugh at the question is like you can go on Twitter and see conspiracy theories about it, like, oh, it's all big pharma, et cetera. Like the sort of, not to be rude or anything, but the classic like RFK voter like thinks it's big pharma, right? And like there's that like continuum, right? And yes, certainly there are big pharmaceutical companies that do fund anti-legalization work and research, and that is absolutely true. However, at the end of the day, uh, I would really point the finger at social conservatives, right? Like at the end of the day, it is really social conservatives who just do not want another drug being legalized in the U.S. And a lot of it, like any sort of company that is funding this work, like it's not really road safety they care about, right? It's not really the children. I mean, the children are an excuse for so many social activist causes in many ways. It's like they just do not like weed. Social conservatives do not like weed, and they will fight tooth and nail to not have it be legalized, not have cannabis reform happen. Now, look, like I do think I don't want to sort of hand wave away the pharma argument. Like it's credible to a certain extent. There are very many pharmaceutical companies who are threatened, I think, by the possibilities of compounds in the cannabis plant and what they could bring, right? For sleep, um, especially sleep, I would say, but for better health in many ways. I mean, these are plant botanicals that threaten drugs that they've spent millions to put through clinical trials and patent. And so, of course, they are fighting it. However, like that grand conspiracy that the pharma industry is trying to keep weed illegal, I don't know. That kind of dies on the vine to me when the simple explanation, the Occam's razor explanation, is that evangelicals and social conservatives don't like it, and they're still a hugely powerful voting bloc. They sit in many corporations, economic development boards, police unions, etc. Like this is the grassroots that really matters to push back against it.
Yeah, and I think it's
I don't know
also
if you would agree with
no,
that,
no.
but
Well, it's funny. Like
yeah,
I actually happen to know some people in the pharmaceutical realm, and it's laughable to think that they're not also quietly doing their own research that we probably don't know about. It's laughable to think that they don't
totally.
want to make a shit ton of money when it flips. And so that to me has always, to your argument, why that dies on the vine for me is like those guys, the second they can, are going to make a shit ton of money off of it.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I will say, like, this gets at sort of the nuances of the argument a little bit, but it's like, pharmaceutical companies have an invested interest in being able to isolate a specific molecule or compound and patent it, right? Cannabis is a natural botanical, and this is not my expertise, so just sort of hear out my argument. But cannabis is a natural botanical where all these molecules work in consort with each other, right? That is much harder to patent and to extract value from, and to even get it passed through the clinical trial the way the FDA is set up. And so, I think there is I think cannabis does pose a challenge in terms of the botanical nature of what it is, versus ibuprofen, let's say, where they can take that specific molecule, extract value, protect it with patents, right? And so, I think that's absolutely operative. But to your point, no, absolutely. I mean, look, if they could do that with any sort of rare cannabinoid and set up the supply chain to do it, they would certainly do it, right? Like they're not silly about that. These are savvy operators.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with everything you said. We're going to put on our rose-colored glasses one more time, Jeremy. So I know that you're very dialed in with kind of with Washington D.C., which is why it's so cool to have you on here. With some of the staffers you talk to. Democrats are getting their asses kicked all across the country right now. Generally speaking, things are cyclical. We'll see. Let's assume that the midterms go their way. Let's assume that maybe there's a Democratic president. Do you get the sense that this is an issue that Democrats actually want to pursue?
Yes. And look, I'm very willing to share my bias. Like I am not a Republican and never have been, right? If you want to bring up a counterfactual, uh, had Harris won the presidency, I don't know what the House would have looked like. I don't know how that would have, affected the down ballot races on political science terms. Like again, I'm just theorizing. Look, if Harris won the presidency and the Democrats won the House, we'd be in a world where they're trying to pass, whether it's rescheduling or potentially full legalization. That would have occurred. I mean, Harris, she introduced the MORE Act, which would have legalized, removed it from the controlled substances and directed states to legalize in 2020, right? Like she supported this legislation. Obviously, as a junior senator, the political calculus is different than when you're the president, but they would have moved on this issue well ahead of Trump and the Republicans. Now, would they have gotten it passed in the House? Like that certainly depends on the House, right? The makeup, the composition, whether Republicans are willing to play ball. But there are enough Republicans who do support cannabis legislation that I believe they would find a lot of sympathetic ears for a widely popular issue. And so, look, like I think the industry would be in a different place, in a different world had Harris won. Again, she didn't. And so, we have to deal with the hand we're dealt. In terms of the midterms, I don't know. I mean, the Senate calculus seems just too tricky for Democrats right now. And so if they don't win the Senate, I don't know if I think any sort of legislation that even if the House turns blue, I think it's going to die in the Senate. Unless it's very, very targeted. Like I think there's compelling reasons for Republicans to vote for increased access for veterans, let's say, potentially something like the Safer Banking Act. Although I think, by my count, it's passed the House like 7 or 8 times, I think. And so, like at a certain point, it's like this legislation may not go any further. So look, like I don't know. I think, yeah, of course, the Democrats winning the House does make things more favorable for cannabis regulation. However, at the end of the day, like this is up to Donald Trump, right? And it's a little bit scary to have your business and your livelihood be in the hands of Donald Trump. So which I'm sure you could relate to in many ways, right? And we all could. So, but look, again, I'm willing to say it may be a really good thing that it's in the hands of Donald Trump. He may move on this, or nothing could happen, or things like the glasshouse raids could happen.
Yeah, it's a potpourri of absolute. No one knows what the fuck is going to happen with that man. So I think
It's a great word, potpourri.
yeah,
That's perfect.
it's a fool's errand to try and divine anything.
Yeah.
Jeremy, what are you excited about covering going forward? Looking at the future, I know reporters don't generally like to talk about what they're pursuing, but just in general, what are you excited about covering over the next 2 to 3 months?
Yeah, no, man. I think here's one thing I'll say. Like, I think we talked a lot about the doom and gloom, right? And that's certainly my perspective, my reported perspective about, the near term future of cannabis. Uh, the long term future, I think, absolutely stands, right? This is a product that people have consumed and loved for centuries, if not millennia. When you go back, I mean, the Scythians were burning it in their tents, right? I mean, this is something that people love. They will continue to love. And I think the energy at the grassroots level is very, very strong, right? I mean, again, like there's a lot of doom and gloom headlines about the public markets. I mean, although it's been a pretty good run this year for cannabis, I will say that. But a lot of doom and gloom about the public markets, a lot of doom and gloom about the prospects for federal reform. There is, increased opposition in many states, as you are well aware of, with the billboards in Arizona. However, at the grassroots level, like walk into any dispensary in Brooklyn where I live, and it's packed with people who just love buying weed, right? Like people are stoked, they're super excited about it, and that's not going anywhere. And I think the consumer level, the new product innovation, like is just incredible to see. I mean, I was at Revelry, excuse me, which is a B2B conference. I was at the B2B version of the conference last week, and there's 550 buyers in the room in New York, right? There's an unprecedented amount of business going on. Now, will all these brands survive? I don't know. I mean, there's going to be a shakeout, right? But the energy at the consumer level, at the grassroots level, is fascinating, and it really belies, I think, this doom and gloom story that we tell about the public markets, about federal regulation, right? Like people love buying weed, they love growing weed. all these new form factors are coming up, whether it's beverages, vapes, like whatever it may be. I mean, there's a lot of novel innovation in it. And I think, we are quickly moving to a time when, you could get a cannabis beverage at a Knicks game. And like, how incredible is that? So yeah, I'm absolutely excited about that. And I'm absolutely excited to see where brands go, the new markets they attract, the new products they develop, all the above. The shopping, retail experiences, like that stuff to me is fun and exciting. And, at the end of the day, like, I love the plant. I love consuming the product. Like going to a grow is equally as exciting now as it was, in 2016, right? Like that does not get old, and I love it. And so that's not going to change.
Awesome. Well, Jeremy, we appreciate having you on again, folks. If you're not following Jeremy, you should be. We'll have links in our podcast. But Jeremy, thank you again, man. So appreciate your time today.
Of course. Thanks so much, Greg. This was a blast. Do it again.
For sure.